Did you know a single book ignited, I mean, really ignited, a national firestorm? It forced this deep look at intelligence, race, and the very fabric of American equality.
It really did. And that's what we're diving into today, the whole controversy around the bell curve.
Yeah, the bell curve, intelligence and class structure in American life. We're looking at it through the collection of responses, right? The
Yep.
bell curve debate, history, documents, opinions.
Exactly. That anthology edited by Russell Jacoby and Naomi Glauberman. And, for listeners interested in digging into complex stuff like this, the YouTube channel Mindful Moments is a great resource.
Oh, yeah. What do they do?
They offer AI book analysis, sort of designed to spark reflection and critical thinking, useful for unpacking challenging topics.
Good to know. So our mission today really is to unpack the core arguments from the bell curve itself and then get into the main criticism.
Right, to give listeners a clearer path through what is, let's face it, a really complex and often heated discussion.
Absolutely. So let's start with the book itself. Herrnstein and Murray, 1994. What were the key points that, caused such a stir?
Okay, so they basically laid out four main controversial arguments. First, they said IQ is becoming like the main determinant of economic success in America.
Okay, so your intelligence dictates your place, essentially.
That was the implication.
Yeah.
Second, they argued pretty strongly that intelligence is substantially heritable, meaning largely genetic.
Right.
Third, and this is a huge flashpoint, they claimed there were significant differences in average IQ scores between racial groups.
Oh, okay, that's, highly controversial. And the fourth point?
The fourth was that because of these first 3 points, especially the bits about heritability and group differences, many social policies aimed at, say, reducing poverty or inequality might have limited effectiveness.
Wow. Okay. You can see immediately why that would spark a huge reaction.
Oh, absolutely. The book sold incredibly well, became a bestseller.
But the backlash was instant, wasn't it?
Instant and fierce. Came from all sorts of academics, commentators, scientists.
And some of the sources they used, there were questions about connections to things like the Pioneer Fund.
Yes, that came up quite a bit in the critiques. The Pioneer Fund has historical associations that raised red flags for many observers. We can probably touch on that again later.
Okay, so this leads us to the response book, The Bell Curve Debate. How did that come together?
Well, Jacoby and Glauberman put it together pretty quickly, published in 1995. It was a direct answer to the original book.
Trying to provide a counter-narrative, or?
More like a comprehensive guide to the whole controversy. They pulled together 81 articles.
81. Wow.
Yeah, from scholars and thinkers across the whole intellectual spectrum. Their goal was really to capture the fervor and the sheer scope of the debate that erupted nationwide.
Okay, 81 voices. That's comprehensive. Let's get into some of the key criticisms then. What about the science itself? Was the foundation solid?
Well, that was heavily challenged. Many experts questioned the very concept of G general intelligence that Herrnstein and Murray relied on.
Like Stephen Jay Gould.
Exactly. Gould argued that G might not be some inherent biological reality, but more of a mathematical artifact, a result of how the statistics are done.
Interesting. So not even a real thing, necessarily.
Potentially not in the way they presented it. There were also big concerns about the specific statistical methods they used in the book.
And the IQ tests themselves.
Yeah, the limitations of IQ tests were brought up. Critics argued they just don't capture the full, multidimensional nature of human intelligence. There's more to smarts than an IQ score, right?
Definitely. What about the heritability arguments? You mentioned that was point 2.
That was another major area of critique. Many geneticists and statisticians felt they seriously misinterpreted heritability data.
How so?
Well, heritability is a tricky concept. It describes variation within a population. How much of the difference between people might be down to genes in that specific group and environment.
Right, not how much of one person's IQ is genetic.
Precisely. It doesn't mean intelligence is fixed or predetermined for an individual. Critics argued Herrnstein and Murray made leaps in interpretation that the data just didn't support.
Okay, so fundamental challenges to the core science and stats. Let's move to the race aspect, which you said was a huge flashpoint.
It really was. The claims about IQ differences between racial groups were strongly contested on multiple grounds.
Like what?
Well, first, the whole concept of race itself. Critics pointed out it's a really problematic and poorly defined category from a biological standpoint. It's more of a social construct.
So comparing groups based on shaky definitions.
Exactly. And beyond that, the evidence presented for a genetic cause of these observed group differences was seen as extremely weak, or even non-existent.
What did they emphasize instead?
The critics heavily emphasized the massive role of environmental and social factors. Things like socioeconomic status, quality of schooling, nutrition, exposure to bias, and discrimination.
All the things that profoundly shape opportunities and potentially test performance.
Right. They argued the bell curve gave far too little weight to these environmental factors.
You mentioned Glenn Loury earlier. What was his take on this?
Loury raised a really important point about the potential use of the book's arguments. He worried it could offer a kind of intellectual cover to dismiss the ongoing struggles within African American communities.
Sort of saying it's inherent, so there's not much we can do.
That was the concern, that it could feed into narratives that downplay systemic issues or the legacy of racism.
And the history of intelligence testing itself plays into this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There's a well-documented history of cultural bias in the development and application of IQ tests, which critics argued wasn't adequately addressed.
So beyond the science and the race issues, what about the policy side? Point 4 was about the limited effectiveness of social policy.
Yes, and this drew enormous criticism too. Many saw the book as providing a kind of justification for cutting back on social support programs, for minimizing efforts to tackle structural inequality.
Because if intelligence is largely fixed and genetic, what's the point?
That seemed to be the implication for many readers and critics. It promoted a rather fatalistic view of social mobility, suggesting people are largely locked into place by their IQ.
Which obviously raises huge ethical questions.
Huge ethical concerns. The potential for reinforcing harmful stereotypes about certain groups, for undermining belief in the possibility of positive social change.
Did anyone frame it explicitly as being about policy?
Yeah, analysis from places like Vox, for instance, characterized the bell curve as being fundamentally a policy argument. They suggested it was less a neutral scientific inquiry and more an argument against things like investing more in improving the living standards and educational opportunities for poor kids.
So a potentially motivated argument disguised as objective science.
That was the accusation from many critics, yes, that it served a particular ideological agenda.
And this connects back to the historical context you mentioned earlier, eugenics.
It does. Critics drew direct lines between the arguments in the bell curve and the earlier, now discredited eugenics movements. Well, partly through the citation of researchers linked to the Pioneer Fund, which, as we mentioned, has historical ties to eugenics and white supremacist ideologies.
So funding sources were a red flag.
They were. And more broadly, the very idea of ranking racial groups based on innate intelligence echoes those older, deeply problematic theories of racial hierarchy that science has largely rejected.
It's a heavy historical context. Glenn Loury also had that concept of the spiritual blind spot, didn't he? What was that about?
Yeah, that's a really insightful critique from Loury. He argued that, look, even if you were to hypothetically accept some of the book's empirical claims, which, again, most experts didn't.
Right, a big if.
A very big if. But even then, Loury said the book suffered from a profound moral failure, a spiritual blind spot. Meaning it failed to recognize the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their IQ score or group affiliation. It reduced people down to a number in a way that ignored their fundamental humanity.
That's powerful. It shifts the focus from just data to, well, values.
Exactly. It highlights an ethical dimension that can get lost when you're just debating statistics. And, exploring these deeper ethical questions is something resources like Mindful Moments or our discussions here try to encourage, developing that critical thinking.
Absolutely vital. So bringing it to today, why does this debate, sparked decades ago, still matter? Why should we still be talking about the bell curve?
Because the core issues haven't gone away. Questions about intelligence, genetics, race, inequality, the role of education, the effectiveness of social policy, these are all still hotly debated.
We still see arguments about nature versus nurture, about group differences.
All the time. And understanding the arguments, the criticisms, and the historical context of the bell curve debate gives us crucial tools to navigate these contemporary discussions more thoughtfully.
It helps us spot recurring themes or flawed arguments, perhaps.
Exactly. It equips us to be more critical consumers of information when claims about intelligence, race, and social outcomes are made. It underscores why scrutinizing the science, the history, and the ethics behind such claims is so important.
So to sum it up, the Bell Curve Debate anthology really stands as this vital, multifaceted critique of a hugely controversial work.
Definitely. It lays bare these deep, fundamental disagreements about what intelligence even is, whether race is a meaningful biological category in this context, and ultimately, what kind of society we want to build.
It really forces a hard look at the foundations of arguments that link intelligence to social destiny.
Yeah, it pushes us to question claims that seem to offer simple, maybe too simple explanations for complex social problems.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe for our listeners. As we navigate all this complexity we've talked about, what responsibility do we have to critically evaluate information, especially when it seems to justify existing inequalities?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? It's ongoing work for all of us.
Indeed. So we encourage you to subscribe to stay informed on topics like this. Share this discussion if you found it valuable. If you want to dive deeper, consider checking out the bell curve debate, or even the original bell curve. Links are in the show notes.
And most importantly, just keep thinking critically. Question the information you encounter.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.